I still remember that moment like a scratch that never healed. In the middle of my son's wedding, while the music was still playing and people were raising their glasses, Nicole turned pointed straight at my wife and said, "She stole my mother's jewelry." The room went silent. Dorothy froze. Her hand began to shake, like a clock hand with a broken gear. 300 eyes fell on one gentle woman, a woman who had never taken anything from anyone in her life. And that was only the beginning. Before I go on, if you're listening this far and this story touches something real in your heart, please subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. Your presence matters more than you think. And now, let me take you back to the very first moment, when a day that should have been the happiest became the deepest crack in my family. I sat alone in the dark garage. The door was pulled down more than halfway, just enough for a strip of streetlight to cut across the concrete floor. In my hand was an old pocket watch. The glass was cracked by a thin line. The second hand was frozen, stopped at a position that made no sense. I had repaired thousands of watches in my life, but that night I could not touch this one. From inside the house, I heard Dorothy crying, soft, steady, as if she were trying not to wake anyone. We had just come home from our son's wedding, a day that should have ended with smiles. I remember that morning clearly. The mansion in New York shone like a showroom, marble stairs, high ceilings, fresh flowers lined up in long rows. Dorothy walked slowly beside me. Her hand rested on my arm. An old habit. She chose a simple dress. Neutral colors. "No need to stand out," she said. "It's our son's day." I nodded. I thought so too. The ceremony went smoothly, until it didn't. When the guests had taken their seats, when the background music softened, a sharp voice cut through the air. Mrs. Sterling, Nicole's mother, jumped up from the front row. Her face had gone pale. She said a family necklace was missing from the dressing room. Its value was mentioned immediately, like a reflex. I looked around. Heads leaned toward each other. Frowns appeared fast. Nicole stepped forward. Her high heels stopped right in front of Dorothy. She said my wife was the last one to leave the room. Her voice was clear, not shaking. Then she used words I never expected to hear on a day like that. Words that tied poverty to greed, that tied simplicity to bad intentions. Dorothy stood still. I saw her throat tighten. Her hand gripped the edge of her dress, as if she needed something to hold on to. Brian stood there, right beside his bride. My son said nothing. His eyes drifted away, then back, then away again. I understood his confusion. I also understood the cost of silence. But in that moment, all I felt was a space opening between us. The Sterling family demanded to check Dorothy's purse. Right there in the hall, the request was spoken like a formality, but its weight took my breath away. Dorothy opened her bag, slowly, carefully. Tissues, headache medicine, a small notebook. Nothing else. Nothing they were looking for. I thought it would end there. I was wrong. The reception went on, but no one was really present anymore. Congratulations sounded forced. Smiles slipped away too quickly. I took Dorothy home early. In the car, she said nothing. Her breathing was steady, but heavy. When we got home, she went straight to the bedroom. I stayed in the garage, holding the broken watch, as if staring long enough, it could turn time back a few minutes. To before everything went off track. In the days that followed, it did not end. It opened. Nicole sent messages saying that even though nothing was found, the truth still needed to be clarified. She suggested Brian cut contact with us for a while, to keep peace for the new family. I read every line, and saw clearly how words can lock a house, without a key. Dorothy started waking up earlier, then not sleeping at all. She sat at the kitchen table for long stretches, looking out at the garden, without really seeing it. One time, she said she didn't want to go to the grocery store anymore. "I'm afraid people will look," she said softly. I didn't ask who people were. I knew. I tried to keep things in order. I cleaned the garage, wiped every shelf, fixed an old lock. I did familiar work, to keep my mind steady. But every night when I heard Dorothy close the bedroom door, I knew that order was temporary. One question hung in the air, unanswered. Why? One afternoon I came across a photo online. Nicole was wearing a new bracelet. The pattern was unfamiliar. The shine, far too familiar. I stopped, zoomed in, studied every link. A watchmaker learns to see the smallest details. So do I. And for the first time since the wedding, time did not feel frozen anymore. It began to move. Slowly, but with direction. That night, I placed the pocket watch on the table, beside the printed photo. The second hand was still stuck. I was not. I understood then. If I stayed silent, this story would write itself, in someone else's words. And I could not let my wife's dignity hang there, like a broken hand on a clock. I closed the garage door, turned off the light, and I chose to step into the hardest part of my life, to look for the truth, even if it meant other doors would slam shut along the way. After the night I closed the garage door, nothing got louder. It only grew colder. The silence stretched on, like a room with no windows. Brian didn't call. Neither did I. Not out of pride, but because I wanted my son to be the one who chose to step out of that darkness. Dorothy was different. She tried to act normal, but small habits began to fall away. She stopped watering the flowers in the morning. The books she once read halfway through stayed open on the table, no pages turned. One time I suggested a walk around the neighborhood. She shook her head. "I'm tired," she said. But it wasn't the voice of exhaustion. It sounded like a door closing very gently, so no one would hear it. Whispers online began to appear. I didn't search for them. They found me. An acquaintance sent a link and asked quietly, "Are you okay?" I didn't open it. But I knew what was inside, a story retold differently, with just enough added detail to sound believable. Nicole didn't need to say anything directly. She only had to let silence do the work for her. Brian called me after almost 2 weeks. The call was short. He said Nicole was under a lot of pressure. Her family wanted things to calm down. I asked if Dorothy had been mentioned. He went quiet. I heard his breathing on the other end. Then he said, "I'm sorry, Dad." I didn't answer right away. Not because I was angry, but because I was afraid of saying something I couldn't take back. One rainy afternoon I stopped at a gas station on my way home. I saw Brian standing there, a thin jacket, sunken eyes. We looked at each other for a few seconds before anyone spoke. I invited him for coffee. We sat at a small table by the window. Everything outside moved fast. Only time between father and son slowed down. Brian said Nicole had taken control of all his pay, as temporary compensation. He said it was the only way to keep the peace. I asked if he believed his wife. He didn't answer directly. He only said, "I don't know anymore." I looked at his hands. They trembled slightly, as if he were trying to hold on to something slipping away. I didn't blame him. I only saw one thing clearly. Silence had started to take real things. Back home, I opened the photo Nicole had posted again. That bracelet appeared in another picture, a different angle, different light, but the pattern was the same. I printed it out, placed it next to the broken watch. The links repeated a familiar rhythm. I didn't draw conclusions. I only took note. Dorothy began avoiding mirrors. She said the light bothered her. I knew that wasn't the reason. One evening, she asked if we had done something wrong. That question weighed more than all the accusations before it. I said no. I said it with the firmest voice I had. But when she turned away, I knew that answer needed proof, not just words. Nicole sent another message. Polite, cold. She said Brian needed space. She said meeting family right now wasn't appropriate. She didn't mention Dorothy. I read it again and again, seeing clearly how someone can erase a person simply by not saying their name. In the days that followed, I began to observe more. I noticed small things, timing, details, patterns. I called a few old contacts in New York, asked questions that didn't seem related. I wasn't looking for conclusions. I was looking for paths. Each answer opened a narrow passage, not wide enough to walk through, but wide enough to know it existed. One night, Brian texted asking if we could talk privately. I said yes, but he never came. I didn't call back. I put the phone down and sat beside Dorothy. She rested her head on my shoulder, very lightly. I felt her breathing slowly, even out. In that moment, I understood something. Real climaxes aren't in loud accusations. They live in quiet injuries that last. The next day, I drove to New York. No warning, no appointment. I passed familiar streets, places where I once delivered watches to clients years ago. I stopped by an old shop, just to ask around. The owner looked at me, recognized me after a few seconds. We talked about items that change hands quickly, in times when no one wants attention. He didn't give me evidence. He only said one sentence. It was enough to make me stop and think. On the way back, Brian called. He said Nicole was pregnant. He said everything needed to stay calm. I listened. I didn't argue. I only said I needed time. After hanging up, I pulled over. Rain began to fall. Light. Steady. I watched the drops slide down the windshield, and understood that from here on, every decision would carry longer consequences than I had imagined. That night, I opened a drawer, took out an old notebook. I began to write things down. Dates, times, details. Not to accuse, but to keep the truth from dissolving. I knew I was entering a different phase, one where coldness was no longer just a feeling, but someone else's strategy, and I couldn't face it with emotion. I needed patience, beat by beat, like fixing a watch that had slipped out of alignment. Not rushed, not loud, but never stopping. I didn't tell Dorothy about the trip to New York, not to hide anything, but because I had nothing solid yet to place on our kitchen table. I kept up my familiar routines, but underneath another rhythm had started. The rhythm of watching and verifying. The notebook in the drawer grew thicker each day, not with guesses, but with time, places, and small details people usually overlook. I began in places that draw no attention. High-end pawn shops with no loud signs. They survive on referrals, on discretion. I didn't ask directly about the necklace. I asked about items that get broken down to avoid notice. I asked about transactions that happen on days no one wants to be remembered. How you ask matters as much as what you ask. I learned that from my trade. Off by just a little, and the hand runs wrong. One man told me that recently more items had passed through middle brokers than usual. He didn't mention names. He mentioned timing. I wrote it down. Another spoke of an unusual transfer of money, with silence attached as a condition. I wrote that down too. Loose pieces began finding their places. Back home, I printed public financial records from a few companies tied to the Sterling family. I didn't need to know how wealthy they were. I needed to know where money went when no one was looking. Numbers don't lie, but they don't explain themselves either. I spent evenings reading slowly, like studying an antique watch. Every gear, every tiny axle. And then I saw gaps, short-term loans, assets revalued too quickly. Things that appear only when someone is trying to keep a surface polished. Dorothy noticed the change in me. She asked if I was tired. I said no. She asked what I was thinking about. I said I was fixing a difficult watch. She smiled very softly, as if she understood, and she didn't ask more. I knew she was trusting me through silence. That responsibility weighed more than any demand. One morning I received an email from a collector I had met years ago. He didn't write much. He sent a transfer receipt. The date and time matched the wedding day. The recipient's name was Nicole. The amount was large enough to cover several short-term debts. I sat still in front of the screen for a long time. Not because of the money, but because of the precision of the timing. People who calculate carefully often choose the busiest moments to handle their private business. I didn't rush to conclusions. I called an old friend in the insurance field. I asked about common scenarios when an item disappears at just the right time. He talked about procedures, deadlines, how stories are built clean enough to pass through systems. I didn't ask about Nicole. I asked about principles. And principles are coldly consistent. Brian started calling more often. His voice was no longer steady. He said Nicole couldn't sleep. He said pressure from her family was heavy. I listened. I didn't argue. I asked him only one question. Do you get to see everything? He didn't answer. The silence on the other end lasted longer than usual. I wrote down the call time. An old habit returned. Not to control my son, but to make sure nothing slipped past. Then the letter arrived. A white envelope. Neatly printed letters. Non-disclosure agreement. The wording was polite, almost courteous. They offered my silence in exchange for access to my unborn grandchild. I read slowly, line by line. I placed the envelope on the table, next to the notebook. For the first time, this was no longer just about dignity. It became a test of what I would choose, when forced to trade one thing for another. That night I told Dorothy. I didn't hand her the envelope right away. I spoke first about the choice. She listened, didn't interrupt. When I finally placed the envelope in front of her, she stared at it for a long time. Then she said, "If you sign it, I won't look at you differently. But I won't sleep in peace." There was no blame in her voice. She simply set the truth where it belonged. I didn't sign. I didn't tear it up. I put the envelope in the drawer, beside the notebook. I knew from that moment on everything would shift. People who write scripts don't like it when a supporting character refuses the role. In the days that followed, I gathered the rest. Enough to connect the pieces. A short clip from a dash camera. A car parked near the dressing room. Saved automatically. The angle didn't show faces clearly, but it showed something familiar. The way an item was passed, the way it was received, the way someone glanced at a watch. I wasn't happy to have it. I just felt lighter, like finding the final screw that secures a loose gear. Brian came to the house late one evening. He said Nicole knew I had been asking around. He said things were going too far. I asked him once more, slowly, "Do you want peace, or do you want the truth?" He lowered his head. I didn't need the answer spoken. After he left, I stood alone in the garage. The pocket watch still lay on the table. I replaced the glass, adjusted the axle. The second hand began to move. Steady, not fast, not slow. I knew I was ready for the next step. Not to destroy, but to reveal. And sometimes revealing is the only way a family still has a chance to stand upright again. I didn't sleep much in the nights before that dinner. Not out of fear, but because I was weighing every small detail, like resetting a mechanism that had been running wrong for too long. I called and invited everyone in the most ordinary voice I could manage. I said it was an apology dinner, a way to close a misunderstanding. I chose words without sharp edges. Nicole agreed very quickly. So did the Sterling family. Brian was silent for a few seconds. Then he said he would come. Dorothy prepared the table the way she always did. She laid out a clean tablecloth, chose the simple dishes. I didn't ask her to do anything differently. Normalcy was the only thing holding the house upright that day. When the guests arrived, Dorothy greeted them with a soft smile. No more, no less. I saw her hand tremble slightly as she poured water. I placed my hand over hers for 1 second. That was enough. Dinner began with polite conversation. The Sterling family talked about work, about upcoming plans. Nicole spoke more than usual. She talked about maturity, about boundaries, about self-respect. Each sentence was placed carefully, as if rehearsed in front of a mirror. Brian sat still, back straight, eyes lowered to his plate. I let them talk. I didn't interrupt. A climax doesn't come from cutting someone off. It comes from letting things reveal themselves. When the main course arrived, Nicole turned to Dorothy. She said wounds could only heal through acknowledgement. She spoke of taking responsibility as the only path to peace. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was enough to quiet the room. I looked at Dorothy. She didn't react. She simply set her spoon down, very slowly, like placing a final period at the end of a paragraph that was never hers. I stood up, not in a hurry. I said I had prepared a different kind of apology, not with words, but with clarity. I pulled the curtains closed, turned off the main light, turned on the projector I had set up in advance. A blue glow spread across the wall. Nicole leaned forward, slightly surprised. The Sterling family exchanged looks. Brian lifted his head. The video was short. Footage from a dash camera. A car parked near the dressing room. The timestamp was clear. The image wasn't sharp, but it was enough. Enough to recognize the wedding dress. Enough to see a man waiting. Enough to see one hand extend and another receive. There was no sound, only movement, and in that silence, all explanations became unnecessary. Nicole jumped to her feet. She said it was a misunderstanding. She said the video had been edited. I didn't argue. I moved to the next item. A simple timeline, printed large, dates, times, locations, a transfer receipt from the collector, matching the moment in the video. I didn't speak much. I simply pointed to the markers, the way I once showed apprentices how far a minute hand had drifted from true. The Sterling family began to murmur. Mr. Sterling asked about the source of the materials. I said an old friend had verified public records. I placed a thin folder on the table. Short-term loans, assets revalued too quickly. No accusations, only data. No verdicts, only alignment. Nicole turned to Brian. She said everything she did was for the family. She said pressure had pushed her too far. Her voice rose, then broke. Brian looked at her for a long time. Then he looked at me. I didn't nod. I didn't shake my head. I let him stand where he needed to stand. Dorothy rose from her chair. She said only one sentence, very calmly. I have never taken anything that wasn't mine. The words didn't need evidence. They stood because they were true. I saw her shoulders relax, as if she had finally set down a weight she'd been carrying for weeks. No one continued eating. I turned the lights back on. The room looked normal again, but no one could pretend anymore. The Sterling family said they needed time. I said they had it. Nicole stayed silent, eyes red. Brian asked to step outside. I didn't stop him. Important decisions need space. When the door closed behind them, the house grew strangely quiet. Dorothy sat down. I sat beside her. We didn't speak for several minutes. The truth had been placed on the table. What came next wasn't ours to decide. That night, Brian returned alone. He said he had filed for divorce. He said he would do what needed to be done to fix things. I listened. I didn't judge. I only told him to get some rest. In his eyes, I saw a different kind of exhaustion. The kind that comes from stepping out of a story that was never truly yours. After he left, I cleared the table, put the projector away. I opened the drawer and took out the envelope. The non-disclosure agreement. I didn't open it. I placed it in a paper box, along with the printouts that were no longer needed. Not to erase anything, but to close a chapter. I went back to the garage, looked at the pocket watch. The second hand moved steadily. I knew the climax had passed, but the aftershocks remained. The truth rarely ends things right away. It only opens the one path. You can walk without lowering your head. And that night, for the first time in weeks, I believed we had stepped onto that path. Slowly, but in the right direction. After that dinner, the house returned to its familiar rhythm, but the weight was gone. The next morning, I opened the windows earlier than usual. Cold air rushed in. Clean, clear. Dorothy stood at the sink, filling the kettle for tea. She didn't cry. She didn't smile, either. She just did what needed to be done. Slowly. Like someone who had found her balance again. Brian called around noon. He said the procedures would take time. He said the Sterling family had legal counsel, and things would move through proper channels. I listened. I didn't ask more. Those matters no longer belonged to me. What I cared about was his voice. For the first time in weeks, it wasn't drifting. He asked if his mom and I were okay. I said we were at home. A simple answer. The right one. Dorothy began going back into the garden. At first, just a few minutes, then longer. I carried a chair outside and set it under the old maple tree. She chose the familiar plants again, said they could handle the cold and didn't need much care. I dug the soil. She placed the flowers. No one talked about what had happened. There was no need. Some things only need to be set down, not repeated. A few days later, a letter arrived from a law office. Neutral language, no emotion. I read it and set it aside. I didn't feel relieved. I just felt that things were moving the way they should. Not fast, not slow. From my work, I learned that forcing time only damages the mechanism. To let it run. You have to let it run. Brian stopped by one afternoon during a light rain. He carried nothing but a wet jacket. He sat at the kitchen table, looking around the house, as if searching for an old map. Dorothy poured him tea, set the cup in front of him, said nothing. Brian lowered his head very deeply. He apologized. Not long, not complicated. I looked at Dorothy. She placed her hand over his. That gesture didn't erase the past, but it opened the future. We had dinner together. A simple meal. No big advice, no lectures, just small questions. About work, about sleep, about what needed to be done tomorrow. I realized then that healing rarely comes in one moment. It comes from many ordinary moments placed side by side. A week later, I brought the pocket watch out to the table. I wiped the new glass, adjusted the chain. Dorothy watched me and smiled. She said it was keeping time properly. I said it wasn't because I had become better, but because I had become more patient. We laughed softly, not loud, but enough. I didn't see Nicole again. I didn't need to. Some doors once closed should be left alone. I carried no bitterness. It serves no purpose. I carried an old lesson, reminded once more. Honor doesn't need to be displayed to exist. It only needs to be protected when it's placed in the wrong hands. One quiet evening, we sat on the porch. Warm yellow light. Insects humming in the distance. Brian called to say he had found a small apartment near his office. He said he wanted to start over. Slowly. I told him starting slowly is the only way to start right. He laughed. This time the smile wasn't rushed. I thought about everything that had passed. The lavish wedding, the terrifying silence, the accusations spoken too easily, the silence that once made everything worse, and about standing up without raising your voice. Sometimes all it takes is placing the truth in the right light. I look straight at you listening to this story, not to convince you, but to share something I learned later than I should have. Jewelry can change hands. Words can be rewritten. But honor should never be placed on the table as a wager. Don't mistake the kindness of older people for weakness. We were silent not because we didn't know, but because we were waiting for the right moment. Our story ends with another dinner. No guests, no ceremony, just 3 people around an old wooden table. Dorothy talks about the new flowers blooming. Brian talks about the first sketch for a small project. I listen, adjusting the watch in my hand. The second hand moves steadily. Family isn't built on diamonds. It's built on truth and compassion. When those two are in the right place, everything else finds its rhythm. And that night in our quiet suburban home, I knew we had taken the wheel of our lives again. Not loudly, but firmly. Thank you for staying until the very last moment of this story. If it made you think, if it touched something familiar in your own family, please subscribe to the channel, press like, and share. So real stories like this can reach more people. The lesson I took away is simple. The truth doesn't need to shout to exist, and kindness is never a sign of weakness. Families can be tested by money, pride, or misunderstanding, but only honesty and compassion keep them standing. Thank you for listening.